Okay, it's 11 o'clock. I think we're going to start right on time here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on transitioning transit. The description is highlighting needs and benefits of electrifying transit. We have a great panel here. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to let each one of our panelists introduce themselves for a few minutes. And I just wanted to let everyone know format today is going to be pretty informal. We are going to do introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about electrifying transit and the need to kind of get us into the topic area. And then I have some prepared questions for our panelists. And then we're going to go to question and answer from the audience for the last 15 minutes. Feel free to use the chat function in the chat tab, as well as the question and answer tab throughout the panel session today. I'll try to monitor both of those things, and it's also great to kind of hear how everyone's thinking about the conversation. And just a little bit about myself. My name is Ingrid Fish. I work for the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I've worked for the city for 17 years now. My work, kind of the history of my work is I've been working in climate planning, so I work on the climate sustainability side. Worked to manage the development of our climate action plan, as well as our climate change preparation strategy. From there, I went to kind of really focusing on electric vehicles and manage the development of our electric vehicle strategy at the City of Portland. And now I'm really kind of focusing on generally kind of at-large transportation decarbonization policy at the City of Portland. And in terms of transit, I have been working kind of on the advocacy side with our local transit agency, which is TriMet, and really kind of working with the folks at TriMet to get them to commitment for net zero, fossil fuel free transit. Actually, Maurice, one of our panelists, used to work at TriMet, and he was on the other side of some of the pressure we were giving. So with that, I think we will start. Maybe Maurice, do you want to start with kind of talking a little bit about your work and how it relates to this session? Maurice is the Senior Advisor in the Office of the Secretary for the U.S. Department of Transportation, and I'll let you tell us a little bit about your work, Maurice. Thanks.
Thanks, Ingrid. Good to see you again, and thanks for having me here for this panel. Had an opportunity a little bit earlier to join Secretary Granholm from the Department of Energy on a panel around the new infrastructure law that this president just passed or just signed earlier this week. So again, Maurice Henderson, Senior Advisor to Secretary Buttigieg in the Office of the Secretary at DOT. As Ingrid mentioned, have a long-standing career in public service. Actually, the last couple of years, though, I was in the private sector working for a transportation startup called Bird Rides. Previous to that, I worked as the COO for TriMet, as Ingrid mentioned. But actually, before that, I was her colleague in the city as the chief of staff to Mayor Wheeler. And when I first moved to Oregon 6 years ago, I was the deputy director for the city's transportation bureau. And before coming out to the Pacific Northwest, I was in Washington, D.C. for several years working for the Mayor Bowser, who's still in office now, Mayor Gray, Mayor Fenty in various roles. And I've had other roles in government, in the private sector, both domestically and abroad, as well as in campaigns and advocacy work. And so the work I do today has really been informed by, sort of my lived experience, both domestically and abroad, in terms of the gaps in service, the disproportionate need that communities have. The Biden administration, in fact, on day one, the president signed about 30 executive orders for the administration's, sort of guidance. One of those being an executive order around the focus on equity and how government services, federal government services and resources can be leveraged to bring more equitable solutions to communities that have traditionally been underserved or not served at all. And then as a piece of that, there's a focus on Justice 40. And for those who don't know or aren't familiar, Justice 40 essentially says that 40% of the overall benefits that are being received or achieved should be going to communities that have traditionally been underserved in climate and clean energy investments. And so the work that I do at the department is to obviously advise the secretary, but also to engage with the various administrative offices. So, the FAAs of the world, the FHWAs, FRAs, et cetera, and their leadership teams on policy development and implementation, program development, fund, distribution, things of that nature. So right now we're, at this really historic moment, this once in a generational investment that's just come to fruition through the work of the president and certainly the congressional leaders. And, frankly, folks like the people in the audience probably listening to this discussion right now, the advocates, city officials, et cetera, who really push to see this infrastructure bill get over the finish line. And obviously the other half of the president's agenda, the Build Back Better agenda, which this is part of, is being debated right now. And hopefully we'll see in the coming days or weeks passage of that larger economic package as well. I'll stop there and let my other colleagues introduce themselves.
Great, thanks, Maurice. The work that you're doing right now is extremely relevant to our topic, and it's there's a lot going on at DC right now, so thanks for taking time to join us. Next, Karen Winger works for WSP as the USA Southeast Zero Emissions Lead. And Karen, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about your work.
Thank you so much. So I'm pretty new in my role with WSP. I've been with the company for 7 weeks, but as a zero emissions and part of the zero emissions national team, we can help transit agencies, municipalities, private customers be able to think through and actually go through the work of transitioning their fleet. That includes planning, procurement, facility design, all the from step 1 to the end, whatever people need assistance on. But part of what I can bring my experience to that I brought from WSP is that I've done quite a bit of other work throughout my career. Before I came to WSP, I was with Gwinnett County. I was the transit director in Gwinnett County for the last 6 years. And when you run a smaller agency, you have to wear all the hats and you have to get really innovative with your time and resources. So although we didn't do EV projects, we did a lot of innovation around microtransit and improving access using new tools, leveraging smartphone technology to be able to provide better access to individuals with disabilities and also language. Before that, I worked for a transit operator. So I really understand the contracting business from that experience. Worked with now TransDev for 5 years. And then I also worked with a metropolitan planning organization. And that was right around the time MAP 21 came out. So I did a lot of work with the Human Services Coordinated Transportation Planning. So the equity around that and just getting the new access, the Direct New Freedom programs were really great in terms of getting people to think outside the box. And the very beginning of my career, I started as an operator. So all those different experiences definitely helped me bring a very broad perspective to the table in terms of helping people think through, okay, how's this going to impact my staff? How's this going to impact the customers? How's this going to impact the built environment? How's this going to impact the people in my community? And also personally, my dad was paralyzed when I was young. It was actually just before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I didn't realize at the time because I was younger, but I actually got to see what policy can do to improve an environment for individuals with disability. And I think that speaks, with the Justice 40 initiative and other initiatives out there, how much that policy and having some investment in that can really impact a community. So looking forward to the discussion today, and I'll kick this back over to Ingrid.
Great, thank you, Karen. Your depth of experience, especially from driver on up to kind of operating all sorts of different pieces of leading a transit agency, is extremely useful in this conversation. So the other, Jarrett, we would love to hear from you. You're the Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at Proterra. So actually manufacturing and making and distributing the electric buses. So if you could talk to us a little bit about your work, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it being here today, and it's tough to follow up with those two bios, but I'll do my best. My name's Jarrett Stoltzfus. I'm Director of Government Relations at Proterra. We are one of the largest manufacturers in North America of both transit buses and also batteries for other medium and heavy duty applications. So we started around making our first buses around 11 years ago in 2010. And we've grown over the last decade to over 130 customers across the U.S. from one, and over 1,000 buses built or sold. So, it's been really exciting to see this industry and interest in both zero emission and the importance of electrification and its impacts and benefits for communities to grow and to evolve over time, especially with the interest from Congress and the administration on providing resources to really move us from, thinking about, dipping our toe in zero emission and its benefits to really helping transform sectors across the transportation industry. As Proterra, as I mentioned earlier, we do transit buses. So we make 35 and 40 foot transit vehicles that operate in pretty much almost every state across the U.S. And then we also we've taken our transit expertise and we put our batteries in other heavy duty and medium categories. So we're working to electrify. We have a partnership with Thomas Built Bus for school buses, a company named Komatsu for electrifying construction equipment, a company named Taylor for electrifying forklifts and container handlers at ports, and many other partnerships in the medium and heavy duty space. Transit's really important. Transit vehicles run a lot. The pollution impacts can be significant of non-fossil fuel vehicles. They're also significant in other sectors as well, in ports, school operation, and so forth. So we're working not only in that space but across the board to really bring the benefits of electrification to all these categories. For myself, just my background, I've been in probably clean transportation pretty much my entire career. Before Proterra, I also served on the executive team at Foothill Transit, one of the first agencies to run battery electric buses in the U.S. And then previous to that, I worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where Maurice does now. In the Federal Transit Administration, that's the agency that funds public transit and funded a lot of the early zero emission transit bus and other deployments. So it's really been neat to, I've kind of had different aspects, different viewpoints on different parts of this industry as a funder, as an operator, as a manufacturer. And it's been really amazing to see the growth and interest in electrification across the board and communities adopting this technology and the benefits, emissions reductions, fuel savings, all the benefits that come along from that as well. Not to mention the growth for us and other manufacturers at looking at the benefits of clean manufacturing jobs. We've grown over the last couple of years to grow our plants in California and South Carolina, bringing in good paying manufacturing jobs in EV technology to those states and other places in our supply chain. So, and then the last thing, when I'm not Director of Government Relations at Proterra, I also wear a second hat as a legislator in local government. I serve on the city council of a small city in Prince George's County, Mount Rainier, Maryland. So really, through my time, my career, gotten to see all sides of many issues in government and private side, but also, the challenges and opportunities through the legislative process. So thank you, Ingrid.
Great. Thanks, Jarrett. Welcome. Just to let everyone know, Anise Evans, CEO of EMDEIC Transit Authority, was going to be part of the panel and got pulled away and couldn't join us this is the complete panel. So let me just talk a little bit about why it's important, why what we're talking about is important, and to tee up the conversation. So we are in a climate crisis. Portland, last summer, we had over 100 deaths due to the heat wave that we experienced, and as did many, many cities around the country. And we're really starting to feel this climate crisis. The demographic that's most affected by the climate crisis and the COVID-related health and economic impacts is low income and BIPOC communities. These are also the same communities that rely on transit and are disproportionately impacted by poor air quality, to which the transportation sector significantly contributes. So a key strategy to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector is to incentivize people to get out of single occupancy vehicles and instead ride transit, walk, or bike. Public transit options like bus and rail are actually the most efficient way to move large amounts of people. So if we're successful in achieving our goal of increasing bus ridership, we're going to need more buses to meet that demand. TriMet, Portland's transit agency, is the organization that purchases the most diesel in Oregon. And transit agencies all over the country are big purchasers and users of diesel. We'll need to have a future with robust transit systems, and those buses will need to be zero emission to support our climate and equity goals. So really kind of thinking about this as transit being the anchor of our transportation system, and the importance of having that anchor be clean fuel to not contribute to exacerbating our climate impacts. That gets me to our first question. So how does a transit agency get to the place of committing to transition to fossil fuel free fleet? That's like a tongue twister. Especially in a COVID environment where ridership and the associated funding with ridership is decreasing, but essential workers often rely on transit. So how do we get to this place of getting to a net zero fleet? What are the lessons learned in your experiences? And what's the most promising technological solution? Electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, and or other options. So that's a lot. Don't feel like you have to answer all of the question. You can kind of, pick certain parts that you're especially interested in talking about. Maybe let's start with Karen, since you are kind of working at the national scale and helping transit agencies kind of get to this place. Would love to hear kind of your thinking on that first question.
Absolutely. So how do you get to the place where you're thinking about transitioning? I think it really depends on where you are in the country. Some transit agencies, it's being dictated or told to them through either regulation or their board has said, we're making a commitment to doing this by X date. Some agencies are deciding, this is important to us. We're going to roll this into our general, asset replacement of vehicles. And as we're doing replacement or refurbishing of our transit system. So that's kind of the first, how do you get there and what are you trying to solve? And that's actually one of the lessons learned. Start with the end in mind. Where are you going to go? And that's going to really influence how you master plan your transition into that. With that being said, it's important to be flexible. These technologies, are still evolving, and you don't want to plan yourself into a box where you won't be able to take advantage of, say, a better battery, capacity, or new technologies that develop around charging, or even resiliency. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Resiliency, vehicle to grid, all sorts of exciting things. So definitely have a master plan, but be flexible around that. Another lesson learned is pilot the pilot. A lot of agencies got 2 or 3 buses with the VW money, but they haven't really taken the time to understand, how does this impact my operation? Transitioning to zero emission vehicles is going to impact everybody, not just your maintenance staff, not just your operators. It's going to impact how you schedule. It's going to impact how do you fuel the bus, which is someone plugging it in. Who's going to take care of that? What's your relationship with your utility provider going to be? That's going to change. Your utility provider is now your fuel man, and that's a different relationship. And some states and some utility providers are in much better position to change and develop a good, healthy relationship with an agency than others. And it really just depends on where you are in the country. And then, like I mentioned, it's going to involve everyone in your organization, not just the mechanics and not just your best operators. And then another lessons learned I like to say is use a yes if approach. I think in transit and in anyone, we're all reluctant to change. We've done it this way. We know how this in the diesel bus has been around for a very long time. So making the change, can be a little scary, but using a yes if mindset helps set up an organization to say, okay, yeah, we can make this change if we have adequate training, or if we have a workforce pipeline developed, or if we have funding, which thanks to the recent signature of the infrastructure bill, we do have some funding coming. So that part, maybe is less concerning, but they're, understanding what the if parts are helps you really think critically at how you can solve these problems. As far as the technologies, I think that's still being developed. I feel like when I did transit planning, it's always like, it depends, but it really does depend on your operating scenario. What are the conditions in your environment, how readily the fuel is available. And it goes back to doing that initial master planning to help you kind of figure that out, but also leave the flexibility as those technologies develop.
Yeah, that's great. So you're either mandated or your agency decides that that's the way they're going to go, and then you figure things out from there. That's great. Jarrett, Maurice, comments or another perspective on a question? Jarrett, go ahead. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I would have year and a half of this. I would have stopped doing that. No, I just wanted to add on to what Karen was saying. So in some regions, we've seen regions say we want to we want to regulate. In some areas, we've seen environmental push. Some agencies we've seen, hey, we're really excited about the operating and maintenance savings that can come with electric fleet, and with some of the funding resources, whether they've been from, say, FTA's zero emission bus program previously, some of the money potentially coming from the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill, or other resources like VW. We've seen a lot of folks say, hey, there's these new resources dedicated to this tech. We want to really, this is important to the communities we operate in, and this is, we have the resources now to, try something new. I will say, having worked at a couple transit agencies, making there is a transition from one fuel type to another. Historically, when you sold a diesel bus manufacturer didn't sell you the fuel pumps, didn't explain the fuel ecosystem, didn't help you manage the didn't help you manage like fuel purchase strategies. Those are things that usually were outside the scope. For electric, what we've seen is Proterra, we started off just selling transit buses, and then we got into the business of selling chargers, charging installations, doing fleet modeling, and a lot of other ancillary services around the bus itself, because what we realized was that you really need strong partners in electrification. And so we've realized that, because there's a lot of these other pieces that normally an agency might handle on their own, or just their previous manufacturer didn't do that, we realized we needed to step in and help train and help prepare for successful deployments. So we really think, introducing battery electric vehicles to any fleet really begins with a strong partnership between the agency and the OEM, knowing what they're planning to do, how they're planning to do it. If you're going to do a 3-bus pilot, we don't want to just sell you 3 buses and charging equipment and go hands off. We want to work with you through the planning, through the deployment, thinking about how you're operating, thinking about your expansion plans, and so forth. And, as Karen mentioned, the you usually don't have to, if you run diesel buses, you're not working with the utility, at least for your vehicles. But if you're running electric buses, your relationship and engagement with your utility is not only a concern, a concern or an issue, it's one of the most meaningful roles in that deployment of that new technology. So, that's that. And then, helping both utility and yourself thinking through the charging and the infrastructure and the planning, again, which is entirely new at agencies. And again, as I mentioned earlier, as we started working with more and more customers and growing and getting the larger deployments, we actually built teams dedicated to supporting that our customers through the process of installing that charging infrastructure, working with local utilities. And often we've worked with utility providers to see if we can secure favorable rates to support the introduction of new vehicle technologies, knowing that, hey, your utility, you may need to go to your utility and say, hey, we're really trying to do this. Can you help us make it happen? Your utility needs to be an active partner, not a passive partner in that deployment. So thanks.
Maurice, do you have anything to add?
I think they covered a lot of the bases. I mean, I think from at least the DOT perspective, one of the things that we're most excited about from the bipartisan infrastructure law is the fact that there's a $39 billion investment in public transit, which is the largest investment in transit in its history. And frankly, over the last 2 years, between the CARES Act, CRISA, and the American Rescue Plan that the president got through Congress earlier this year, there was another, I think, $69 billion that was focused solely on transit. And then you add in the $7.5 billion that the president's allotted towards a conversion of, diesel transit buses and ferries, for example. There's a significant investment being made in transit to your opening comments, Ingrid, and certainly at the department, we see the importance of creating a space for multiple modalities, but certainly making sure that transit is a major piece of the puzzle as we move towards a zero emission future.
Great. So kind of transitioning a little bit over to equity, although everything I think about transit is just equity is embedded. But specifically, I want to understand your thoughts on how can electric bus rollout program be specifically designed in a way that maximizes benefits to BIPOC and low-income folks. Whoever wants to jump in is welcome.
Sure, I'll take the first stab. I think, as I mentioned in the onset, the president has made climate and equity really the hallmarks for this administration. In hours, if not days, we'll be making announcements around our new Rebuilding American Infrastructure through Sustainability and Equity Grants, the RAISE program, which for folks who've been tracking used to be called BUILD during the Trump years and TIGER during the Obama years. There's going to be, $1 billion invested in communities around the kinds of investments that we've been talking about for the last 20 or so minutes, plus the infra grants that were, released earlier this year as well. And so you're seeing a number of different programmatic activities from the federal space, working with state DOTs and regional partners, transit authorities, focused on ensuring that there's equitable investment in these kinds of technologies, that these technologies, I think it was Jared or maybe Karen as well, mentioned the impact that moving towards a zero emission bus can have in communities. So instead of running a dirty diesel bus and in some cases through a community where air pollution and noise pollution is a problem, now you're going to have a clean electric zero emission bus that's, the noise reduction is immense. Obviously, the air quality considerations are something that are going to be benefits to the community. And then you think about the jobs, as Jared was talking about, the 2 plants in South Carolina and California, jobs that are being created as we are transitioning folks out of combustion engine towards this electrified future or fuel cell future, or whatever the mixture of technology solutions might be. So there's a whole number of benefits that community will be able to see. I think the investment that the president has outlined for the Build Back Better agenda around jobs training and engagement, making sure that living wage jobs that are available to be unionized are out there, making sure that MSIs and HBCUs are also a critically important part of this process as we're looking at the next generation of engineers and planners and the folks who are working on the buses, folks that are ensuring that the infrastructure is being built out there. All of that is being focused on making sure that there's an equitable opportunity for people of color and people from low-income communities.
Anyone else want to add anything? Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, I wanted to, so as a vehicle manufacturer, we're not, we work with agencies that want to deploy zero emissions. So, the decisions we don't dictate, of course, to a transit agency or a city or where they might operate or how they operate their vehicles. But I just wanted to kind of make some comments about the benefits and some of the activities that we've participated in. So, for often, no matter where the route ends up running, a lot of times historically, depot and fueling and storage facilities for a lot of transit agencies end up located in communities that are historically low income, communities of color, communities that have been otherwise disadvantaged. So one of the things that, no matter where those vehicles end up running, turning over a facility with, hundreds of diesel buses that, is quite frankly producing a lot of emissions to a zero emission clean facility has, no matter where the buses end up running, has a significant benefit and significant impact in improving, quality of life and impacts on that community. We've also, we also work with a lot of our customers to help identify funding, and in a lot of those funding programs, I want to kind of call out California specifically. California's funding programs actually have provisions that allow additional funding resources if you're running a vehicle or storing a vehicle in a disadvantaged community, and that's defined in California by a mix of population characteristics and pollution impacts. But what we've seen is those funding dynamics, which are put in place often at the city or the state or at the federal level, really actually have helped a transit agency that just says, I want to run zero emission, look at like the deployment they're going to do, and then put those vehicles on a route or in a yards that are really going to have additional benefits in terms of supporting historically marginalized communities as well. And I know that's something the U.S. Department of Transportation, through the Justice 40 initiative, is really thinking about doing in terms of paying attention to communities that have been sometimes, more disadvantaged, more ignored in terms of the way they look at supporting and funding. So to Maurice's final point, we also look at the resources that the benefits that come from not only the deployment of the vehicles, but also the manufacturing. We've in our Los Angeles plant, we're represented by the United Steelworkers. As we've built this entirely new manufacturing facility, brought a new bus and a battery manufacturing plant online. What we've also done is, in partnership with United Steelworkers and other area organizations, work to build partnerships with local community colleges and other institutions, bringing veterans and other groups into the manufacturing pipeline. So we're building this new manufacturing pipeline, not for our own employment purposes, but also to help build a new industry and more growth of good paying jobs, and to help grow the supply chain and all the jobs, manufacturing jobs, and not just come with the vehicles and the batteries, but all the way down to the 30 other states we source from. So thank you, Ingrid.
Yeah, thank you. I think, a lot of it is like the what is electrifying transit, and the how you do that is extremely important. And that's where kind of the deployment strategy comes in. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just throw in a quick point because I feel like Maurice and Jarrett really covered it. But with transit, it isn't just about the bus and the bus route. It's also about the community that it's running in. And I mean, I think you can go on and on about, the chicken egg, which is important for us, land use in the community, or the bus that's running in it. But There's a great TCRP report that just came out. It's number 226, and it's talking about greenhouse gas emissions, but it also is looking at a systems approach of measuring. So there's the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions just by replacing your diesel bus to a battery electric bus. But there's also a reduction to, hey, now we did some good land use planning and systems planning, and now some people can take their trips walking. You know what's even better than a battery electric bus? Walking. So having, looking at the whole picture, that we have, connected sidewalks, good access, food actually in our community, and not having to get into our car everywhere, is just as important as the battery electric piece.
Yep.
And there's great graphics to steal from that report. They actually have a PowerPoint presentation. They want you to they did a great job, I think, of boiling down sometimes complex numbers and statistics about greenhouse gas. So if anybody needs to use that, it's TCRP report 226.
Awesome. COVID, it's here. We're all dealing with it. Thinking about it within the perspective of transit, how would you say COVID's impacted transit ridership, funding, and the transition to net zero fleets? And any kind of specifics with an equity lens would be great too.
I'll jump in first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because some of the impacts of COVID are also some of the general impacts to, implementing zero emissions in general. And I think the first one, and sometimes this one goes unspoken, is fatigue. The workforce that's been in place, that, I did 6 schedule changes alone in 9 months. So your schedule is changing, you're trying to balance childcare, and now I got to learn a new dang bus, and then, I got to change the route structure. So it's just, having some empathy for the human beings that are behind this, and, being a little extra careful, and maybe it takes more time to do one extra meeting to make sure everyone understands, but just consider that everyone, and it's not just for the operators, it's everyone. It's been a long 19 months, and everyone needs a hug, and we can't hug each other. But that same COVID implications on the workforce is even that much more exacerbated with the zero emission transition. I mean, it's hard enough just to find standard diesel technicians and operators, and now we're looking for a workforce that is a lot more technically trained. And to be honest, there hasn't been a lot of resources or just a lot of interest in the trades in general. And these are great paying jobs, but I think just getting people back into the trades, doing more electrical work, especially with the zero emissions. And there's some great programs out there. I know there's in California, there's a couple great programs. I think Proterra, I remember someone at APTA talking about programs. So a lot of the OEMs are doing programs within, but there has to be a rethink on how we approach the workforce. And someone threw out a great statistic, and I can't remember, it was which makes sense. There's 1% of technicians are women. There's a whole opportunity to bring women into a very high paying job that doesn't require 7 years of schooling. You can go to technical school and start in as a journeyman or apprentice electrician and be able to make a good job, and you're not working a split, and it's, standard hours, and a work, probably a little bit better hours than some of the other jobs when people are trying to balance childcare and the other, the challenges, especially the folks that are in the sandwich generation too. So I'll leave that at that and let Jared and Maurice chime in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just jump in really quickly, Ingrid. I think the number right now is we're at 60% of 2019 levels in terms of transit ridership, across the country, but that number is increasing. And I think, as was mentioned before, there are some transit dependent communities where that number is much higher. As I mentioned, there's been an investment from the federal government. At the beginning of the year, the president's focus around COVID was getting shots in arms and checks in pockets, and making sure that transit authorities across the country were able to continue to keep their workforces working and keep transit systems moving. So that was a $30 billion investment coming out of March in the American Rescue Plan. And that was on top of the other money that I mentioned before, the CRISA and CARES Act money. And so I think COVID has certainly given transit agencies and regional planning offices and cities and communities an opportunity to take a step back to sort of think through the kinds of investment and kinds of structures that are necessary to support mobility within community, safe mobility within community. I think the other thing that our colleagues at FTA have done a great job of is really taking a scan across not only the country but across the globe to see who's got the best practices around making sure that workers are safe. As a former CEO of a transit authority, the thing that I was concerned about, all day, all night, was the safety of not only our riders and customers and other users of the quote system, but it was our workforce and making sure that they were empowered, making sure that their concerns were being heard and measured and felt in a way, and that we were able to respond in a way that was impactful and supportive of their needs. And I think that is even more true in this environment. I think that this investment that the president was able to secure with Congress is something that's going to be transformative for transit. I think the investments that you're going to see in terms of some of the safety protocols and procedures and just assets that are added to some of these fleet vehicles are going to be really important. I think, Karen, you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the fatigue, the stress, the strain that people are feeling. We've heard, some of the horror stories about what's happened on transit over the last few years, and we want to be mindful of that. We know that that's a small percentage of incidents, but it's a real thing. And so these investments are going to allow us to make sure that we're securitizing our fleets, making sure that as they're moving towards greener spaces, that they're also safer. So the connected environment that they're operating in is something that we're really interested in continuing to pursue and invest in. And again, we want a lot of this. And from our perspective, what the Biden administration is focused on is really hearing from communities in terms of their need. We don't want to have a one-size-fits-all approach. We want to make sure that we are being as responsive to the individual needs of individual communities as we possibly can be, in partnership with state DOTs and regional transit authorities, et cetera.
Derek, do you have anything to add? Oh, looks like we might have. Oh, you're muted.
Again, sorry. No, I probably could add a couple more words, but I think Maurice and Karen covered it very well.
Great. I just wanted to, this is the last question I'm going to do, and then we'll go to question and answer. But in Portland, we've had conversations about kind of equity trade-offs related to adding bus routes and increasing the frequency of existing routes versus electrifying fleets. There's just kind of been this trade-off conversation happening, and I'm not sure whether or not it's a true trade-off. I do know that many of our areas where BIPOC and low-income folks live have infrequent access to transit and have less routes. So it really is, getting the service to these areas is important. But at the same time, electrification is extremely important for these communities as well. So I'm just wondering if these types of conversations have happened in your experience, and kind of what your thoughts are on this dilemma of adding more routes and frequency versus electrifying fleets.
I can jump in first. And I feel like this is the cop-out answer, but it kind of depends. Like it's like planning and what is battery electric or fuel cell best for me. And some communities that may actually be where they're at financially, especially before the infrastructure bill, like where they're looking at, okay, the additional workforce or the additional work that we need to put in the facility, or adding in extra routes, especially depending upon when's the last time they evaluated battery electric. Was it when it was 5 years ago and maybe the range wasn't as far and they were looking like at a 2-to-1 conversion, where now, depending on how their runs and blocks are, maybe the battery capacity can cover most of their routes. So it really, in some ways, is a community, question to ask. But, in Portland, for example, if they haven't looked at what is the current state of the technology and how can it compare, and is this a closer to 1-to-1 conversion than maybe if they evaluated 5 years ago and they were looking like, oh, well, we're gonna have to put out twice as many buses to be able to cover these routes. And then it becomes like, okay, we could either actually do the conversion or add the service there. But just a lot of it goes back to good planning and and also where the community just is at in terms of funding and resources available to it. It's like the worst planning cop-out answer, but it sort of depends.
Well, it's the truth, though. I mean, it's not an exact science in many ways, and I think the communities that have made the investment, and Ingrid, you're probably familiar. I think it's still true that Lane County Transit in Eugene, just down the road here from Bend, has the largest all-electric BRT, 11 buses. That was a choice that they made as an agency and as a community to move in that direction. I think we've seen examples of communities across the country, including Portland, that are, taking the approach that Karen was talking about in terms of piloting the pilot, try to figure out what makes the most sense for their environment. And in older cities, I'm a Bostonian in terms of my nurture, and it's an older city. So the questions around how do you make the investments in the kind of infrastructure to support a fully electric bus fleet, those are different, questions than you might have in like a Waterloo, Iowa, for example. And so each community is going to have an individual need, individual focus. And I think that the important thing is that, folks come to the table and have those discussions. I know you mentioned at the outset of your comments, Ingrid, that there's been a lot of advocacy around the situation in Portland. I think that's true of any region in the country where this conversation is going on. And I think it's healthy to have that debate. I think it's something that is really important, and certainly from our perspective, the administration wants to support both community members and advocacy organizations, but also cities and transit authorities and state DOTs that are trying to make tough decisions with limited resources. Now we have an infusion, obviously, of new resources. But I think all of us can fully recognize that this is not going to solve all of the problems. It's not going to be the thing that is the silver bullet. This is certainly a catalytic moment. It is certainly an incredible down payment, an historic down payment. But a lot of that work is still yet to come, and look forward to what the future holds beyond the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and hopefully the Build Back Better agenda being passed as well.
Oh, Jarrett, you're muted.
So sorry. Wanted to follow up on Maurice's comment on that. So again, as a manufacturer, we don't get into the weeds, of course, of telling a community, to make decisions on trade-offs between how they run their service or what they choose to invest in. I just did want to note, transit is the most electrified sector in heavy-duty transportation, and that's been the result of like one single $55 million program in a $13 billion a year Federal Transit Administration budget over the last couple of years. And I know, Maurice and other folks at DRT are looking at a $5.25 billion over 5 years for the low or no emission program. Lots of other resources coming from DOT that doesn't always solve the service versus the capital discussion, but we've gotten to a really good place in this country off a relatively small amount of funding. And we're really excited, really to see what the infusion of money that's coming through the infrastructure bill that'll be deployed by DOT shortly, and possibly in the Build Back Better, if that makes its way through in terms of impacts. Because, we have really gotten to great transit. I want to just make this point. Transit has led the way for electrification in the U.S. in terms of medium and heavy duty. Every other sector, school bus, ports, transit drove that change. Transit drove the technology developments, and it drove ahead all these other industries where all the benefits, pollution, removing pollution, school districts at ports is coming because of that decision by transit agencies to take that step and drive this industry forward with all these benefits cascading across communities, marginalized communities, and neighborhoods and other places as a result. So I just, I do want to just kind of pause there and say, we're often very thankful to the leadership that a lot of transit agencies took, especially in the early 2010s and even now, taking steps to electrify, because they were not only driving that benefit for their community, they were creating a new industry, manufacturing industry, and driving innovation into all these other sectors that have these cascading benefits across the U.S.
That's a really good point, Jared. All right, I think we are going to transition a little bit to questions from the audience. Kind of on the topic of the infrastructure law now, not bill. There's a question about, will any of the $40 billion for transit be available for covering the additional cost of purchasing electric buses without transit agencies having to purchase fewer buses? So it's similar to the conversation that we were just having. And then another infrastructure bill related question is about connecting, how does the infrastructure bill connect transit and health equity? Maurice, maybe you can answer those, and then other folks can comment.
Sure. The 39 billion, certainly, I'm sure there will be transit agencies that have really interesting use cases that will, be related to electrification. As I mentioned in my opening comments, there's a $7.5 billion allotment as well for the transition of transit bus and school bus fleets that specifically was called out by the president and kept in by the Congress. So I think that's where most of the funding will come for that transition. And as far as the health equity outcomes, I think we've all sort of highlighted the benefit of having zero emission vehicles riding through traditionally low income communities that have traditionally borne the brunt of polluted areas. They've been subject to sort of the worst air quality in communities. Ingrid, in Portland, some of the worst air quality in Portland is where low-income communities and communities of color live. And so the investment in clean technology, and that's not just transit, that's also your commercial vehicles. As Jared was pointing out, there's been a lot of investment in industrial sectors. Just last week, I think it was, I was meeting with the New York Sanitation Department. They've been running a pilot for the last year with Mack Truck. They've got a sanitation vehicle that's fully electric, same weight as a diesel vehicle. They've seen no service sort of diminishing of services. They're in fact, going back to Karen's comment about piloting the pilot, they're getting ready to buy, I think it was 7 more of these sanitation vehicles, and they're going to be putting snow plows on them. So they'll be the first entity in the country running fully electric sanitation trucks with snow plows in the 7 sectors of the 5 boroughs that they cover. So really exciting stuff, not just in transit, but in all heavy duty vehicles use that we're seeing out there. And so I think there's, obviously funding and health benefits that are coming. And one of the things I'd also just point out for that New York piece, the thing that the deputy commissioner and his team were really excited to tell me was that the workers themselves really appreciated moving to a zero emission vehicle. They were skeptical, but one of the things that's been the biggest benefit is the lack of noise. It is the impact on their hearing that's been a huge benefit to moving towards a ZEV vehicle. So just another thing to think about as we're considering the investment here.
Unless anyone has other comments, I'll move on to the next question. How does a city redesign itself to center walkability, public transportation, and micromobility without provoking backlash from car drivers that threatens to derail continued redesign efforts?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Ingrid, what do you think?
Yeah, everyone's got that.
You're the planner.
Yeah, I mean, we are constantly battling this, there's equity implications to that question as well, right? Like in Portland, at least, there are areas of the city that are really hard to realistically get around without a vehicle. And so I think we need to be cognizant of how important transit is, but also understand that there are families with multiple children and jobs at odd times, and that that vehicles are going to need to be part of the solution moving forward. We hope less a part of the solution, but we really need to kind of balance transit with the need to drive. So it's the million dollar question. It's a difficult question to answer. But Karen, do you want to?
Well, it's the million dollar question, and it's, it also depends on your community. I think it'll always be a struggle no matter where you are, to work with, reducing, especially if you want to do a road diet, like, oh, wow, bring the pitchforks out. And I'm in the Southeast, which, is even more in love with their cars. So just trying to get sidewalks in general can be a difficult thing. But I think I love pilots in general. So, in Boston did this, they threw out some paint, and then people were really amazed that, hey, if we gave bus only lanes, it actually, the bus moved faster and it didn't impact the autos all that much. Pilots is a great way. Because I think the same way the operators and the mechanics are going to be scared, with the change of the transition going from zero emissions, the communities are just as concerned about, this is the way I know my community. How's it going to look when you make the change? And if you can do some, piloting with paint or, however, I did a microtransit pilot again. It's not scary. We're going to try this new thing. And if it's terrible, it's a pilot. It'll go away. So the word pilot is wonderful and can be leveraged greatly. And it also gives you an opportunity, which I think sometimes with transit, for good reason, like you can't experiment with routes, like you shouldn't experiment with routes. But with this new mobility or trying to come up with innovative solutions, you kind of have to give yourself a little bit of room to push the envelope a bit too. And it might not end up 100% where you are, but at least if you can do an iterative approach and go, okay, we're going to win a little sideways here, but if we tweak this pilot here and here, this actually will work really well for our community. And then the other thing I always think is great in general, and this may help with how do you get your community to accept the changes, that I find, just especially in transit, we're all willing to talk to each other. So if you've heard about another community that's done successful outreach that worked out well, I can almost guarantee that if you call that community, someone will pick up the phone and talk to you. I don't know if other industries are like that, but I find transit's we're always willing to help each other out. We don't have to reinvent the wheel if someone else has already figured it out.
Other comments?
I'll just point out that there's $11 billion for safety projects in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And, to Karen's point, when we're thinking about the connection to transit for community members, that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. So as we're looking at all the multimodalities and how we can connect people to transit, making sure that the safety for drivers as well as walkers and people rolling who are differently abled, et cetera, is something that's a really fundamental focus of our work here at DOT. And certainly as we start to provide some of these grant opportunities for communities and transit authorities, I know that they've been thinking about them by and large as well. So, look forward to that opportunity to engage.
Okay, we have 3 more minutes, so I think I might just move on to the last question here from the audience. Question is what about novel ownership models that could change the economics for agencies? Do the panelists know of any such models? Go ahead, Jarrett.
Yeah, we've actually had different financing and ownership models in transit and actually also in school bus. So we've had transit agencies traditionally purchase our vehicles with grant funding. We've done innovative leasing approaches where they lease the vehicle or they buy the bus but they lease the battery to spread the cost out over time and pay for the difference with the fuel and the maintenance savings. And then we've also seen some innovative partnerships, for example, with a lot of times utilities. For example, up in Beverly, Massachusetts, this is a school bus example, but we've seen utilities opt to pay for the cost of the school bus with the ability to use the school bus as energy storage, feeding energy, taking energy off the grid at peak times and feeding it back in when needed. So, we've continued to be really pleased as a manufacturer at trying to find different ways of purchasing or leasing or delivering different projects. We've seen a couple transit agencies look at the possibility of public-private partnerships, the P3 delivery model, to kind of handle the one-time capital transition from, say, CNG to zero emission. A number of states or large transit agencies have taken the lead at thinking about those models, which can be replicable elsewhere as well. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll stop there and let my colleagues weigh in.
We have 1 more minute. So does anyone want to say something really fast?
You could look at there's the largest EV school bus deployment in Montgomery County, Maryland. I think that's one of the ideas you were pointing towards there, Jared. I had talked to the company out of Massachusetts, Highland. I think it's Highland Technologies is partnering. Yeah, partnering with the county, and part of their use case was Highland did some of the capital investment on the front end to de-risk the purchase by the district. So another quote novel innovation or financing approach that was used to get electrified vehicles into the district faster.
Yeah, that was Highland Electric Transportation for folks listening, with a Thomas built bus actually, and with Proterra's batteries in there as well. But it's as Maurice mentioned, a really neat delivery model and way to look at helping make this transition happen, especially for a cash-strapped entity like a school district.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for a fantastic panel. Your expertise, experience has been really useful, and the infrastructure law is extremely exciting to kind of see how some of this conversation actually will play out in real life. So keep up the good work, and it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Thanks for everyone else for joining us.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jarrett. Thank you.
Thank you.